Have you ever taken a picture of a unique moment and when you looked at the back screen of your camera, it was way too dark or way too bright? If so, stick with me because in this video we'll be talking about exposure. Hey, Lobato here, and in today's video we'll combine the information about aperture, shutter speed and ISO from our previous videos and learn how to work with them to get the proper exposure for our shots. I will also show you how to check the exposure after taking a picture and how to plan beforehand to nail the exposure every time. First things first, let's talk about what is exposure and why it matters to us. Exposure can be thought of as a way to measure the amount of light captured by the camera, and it is really important since it helps us as photographers to get maximum details in both darker and brighter areas of the picture. When a picture is darker than what the exposure should have been, we say that the picture is underexposed. If it's brighter, then the shot is overexposed. Remember from the past videos that shutter speed and aperture actually affects the amount of light captured by the sensor of the camera, and the ISO controls the sensitivity to light? These three elements combined will control the exposure of the shot. Look at this triangle here. Each one of the sides represent one of the three pillars: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Let's remember how aperture controls the amount of light that hits the sensor of the camera. Wider apertures, f1.2 as an example, will allow for lots of light to hit the sensor, and smaller apertures such as f22 will cause the image to be darker. Jumping to shutter speed, remember that slow shutter speeds, 30 seconds for this example, will brighten the image, and faster shutter speeds, 1/4000th of a second, yields a darker image. For ISO, the higher the ISO, the brighter the image. So with ISO 100 we have a darker image, whereas using 12800 will give us a brighter image. Look now at the vertices of the triangle. We can understand now how each one of these pillars affect the others. Using slow shutter speeds as an example means that we can use lower ISOs and smaller apertures. Using wide apertures will help us reduce the ISO and use fast shutter speeds. With high ISOs, we can use faster shutter speeds and narrower apertures. Now that we have seen how these parameters are related to exposure, and we know how changing one of them would affect the others, let's get back to the triangle to add the other factors controlled by the three pillars: depth of field, motion and noise. Before we do that though, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Remember when I explained how aperture controls the depth of field? Let's add this to our exposure triangle. Smaller apertures will provide us with a deep depth of field, meaning that more of the scene will be in focus. Wide apertures, on the other hand, will cause a shallow depth of field, meaning that only a small portion of the picture will be in focus. For the shutter speed, remember that I showed you how it controls the way movement is captured? Slow shutter speeds will cause moving subjects to be blurred, and fast shutter speeds will freeze the moment. For the ISO, we can relate the sensitivity of the sensor to the amount of noise generated. The higher the ISO, the higher the sensitivity, but also the higher the noise introduced into the picture. And the lower the ISO, the lower the sensitivity, and thus lower the noise. Now we have a more complete visualization of the exposure triangle, and we can relate each one of the settings not only with the exposure, but we understand how the three pillars affect each other and how they interfere with other relevant aspects of photography. Moving on, we need to discuss how to combine all of these things we talked about and how to use these to get the proper exposure. First thing we need to decide is whether aperture or shutter speed is more relevant for our shot. To do so, we need to ask ourselves, is movement or the lack of an important part of the scene? Do we need a shallow depth of field to isolate our subject from the background? For me, after I decided what's the subject of my photo, what I like to do is to have a rough idea of the settings beforehand. Let's say that I will take a hike searching for wildlife. I know that I need to use faster shutter speeds to freeze the action and to prevent motion blur if I'm shooting handheld. As I'm usually carrying a 400mm telephoto lens, I would probably set my shutter speed to somewhere between 1/500th to 1/2000th of a second. In terms of aperture, I will try to use smaller apertures as I want to maximize the depth of field, and because most lenses tend to be somewhat less sharp when used wide open. I usually will set it at f7.1 or f8, and then I will set my ISO, which is the last thing that I would set, so I can get the proper exposure. If I cannot get the shutter speed that I want with the maximum ISO of about 800 or 1250, then I would sacrifice the depth of field by setting my aperture to f5.6. And of course, I would adjust the ISO accordingly. Notice that I would do all of it before I get the chance to see an animal. And often, I will use my surroundings to take some test shots to confirm that the exposure is right. The idea is to reduce the chance of missing shots because of an animal popping out of nowhere and me trying to get my settings right. If I'm shooting a landscape, the process will be similar, but I would set the aperture to get the desired depth of field first, and then I will set my shutter speed based on whether or not I want to capture some moving clouds or if I want to smooth the texture of the lake. And then I will set my ISO to as low as possible. Okay, we know now what is exposure and how to combine the camera settings to expose the image properly. But one question that remains is how to check for the exposure. A useful tool to check for exposure is the light meter on your camera. When you press the button to focus, you can see a little ruler on the bottom of the viewfinder and on the back screen of the camera as well. It's something similar to the one that I'm showing right now. The numbers to the right indicate that the image is overexposed, and the numbers to the left indicate that the image is underexposed. The idea is to have the settings adjusted so that your subject is exposed as close as possible to zero. There is another and more reliable way to check for the exposure, which is using the histogram. I'm not going to dive into histogram in this video, as there is quite a bit of meat around it. I will cover histogram in detail on next week's video. It is important to mention that the exposure meter is a good tool, but it will give us different results depending on the type of metering we are using. In a nutshell, there are three base metering modes: evaluative, center-weighted, and spot or partial metering. Evaluative basically gives you an average reading of the exposure values for the whole scene, using the focal point as a more important area. It's a very useful mode and tends to yield pretty good results when there is not much contrast around the frame. The center-weighted, it's pretty self-explanatory. The camera will calculate the exposure based on the center of the frame and will disregard the rest. We can use it when we are placing the main subject of on the center of the image and when our subject takes over a good portion of the image. The spot or partial metering will reduce even more the area used by the camera to determine the exposure, using only a very small area around the focus point. It is a useful way to get a proper exposure when the subject has a brightness that is too contrasted to the rest of the scene, or when the subject does not take much room of the frame. I took 3 shots using different types of metering modes for exposure so we can compare the results. So let's jump into Lightroom to take a look at it. So I took 3 shots here using different metering modes for my Canon 7D. I used the evaluative, the center weighted, and the spot. I didn't use the partial for these 3 shots. So this one I used the spot mirroring mode, and the focus was roughly on this area here, so it was getting a very dark area. And as you can see, there's a big contrast between what is around the scene and focus here, the subject. So for that, the camera calculated the exposure for this area, and you can see that the area here, it's really bright, the rest of the scene. And you can see that the proper exposure was using 1.6 seconds. For this one, I used the center weighted mode. Once again, there is way more dark areas on the center area here than on the rest of the frame. So because of that, the camera calculated the exposure for this area here. As the center contains a little bit of brighter area here, it calculated the exposure by averaging all of the area here. Because of that, I got keeping all the other settings the same, f4.0 and ISO 200. So I got a shutter speed of 1.3 seconds. For this one, I used the evaluative mode. As you can see, the picture is way darker than the other two because the camera took in consideration the whole bright area here around, like the white wall and the white table here. As you can see, the shutter speed was faster, was 0.6 seconds, and the other settings still the same. This was just to show that different mirroring modes will give us different results in terms of exposure. So that's something that we need to take in consideration and think to decide what is the best one to use for our shots. Before I end this video, I need to clarify that I'm not saying that we'll never under or overexpose an image. There are styles of picture that are purposely shot brighter or darker than a properly exposed image would be. But this decision is well thought and planned for. Now it's just a matter of you picking your camera up and shooting some pictures to familiarize yourself with all the concepts presented here and on the previous videos. Photography, like any other activity, benefits a lot from practicing. That's all for today, folks. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe to the channel. Next week's video is going to be about histogram and how to use it as a way to check for the exposure. Stay tuned, and I will see you on the next video.